Just need to borrow one.
Okay.
Hello.
Ah,
Okay. Okay. Oh, thank you. Good evening. Thank you so much for coming this evening to our conversation about men and their environments.
oh, really?
Yes. Right. They made the KIA their environment today. Certainly, I feel like just a little bit. But we are in for such a treat this evening. We have three distinguished professors with us. I mean, they're all educators in their own right. But I'm going to just read just a little bit about our moderator and our panelists tonight. Please welcome Richard Alexander Liu, who was born in San Diego, California, and raised in San Diego, California, and Tijuana. Richard grew up in a biracial family, which was spiritually and intellectually guided by both an anti-colonialist Chinese father and a culturally affirming Mexicana mother. As a Chicano artist, the consistent themes he has explored are the subjugation of his community by the dominant culture and white privilege. Richard has over 25 years of teaching experience in higher education, over 20 years of arts administration experience, has curated or organized over 50 exhibitions, and continues to produce and exhibit art while teaching and chairing the Department of Art at the University of Memphis. And I can say that he just recently was able to take a little bit of a reprieve from the chair of being of that department after 15 years. And I also just have to note that Richard, I owe a big debt of gratitude to Richard. He has really supported me over the years, and I might not have been standing here before you today if it wasn't for this gentleman here. So I thank him tremendously. Please also welcome Brent Harris. His world and work is created in Kalamazoo, Michigan, where he resides with his two children. Brent received his BFA from Western Michigan University in 1994. Immediately afterwards, feeling the need to do more for his community, he put his art career on the back burner and worked as a paramedic for 7 years and continued sculpting from the front seat of an ambulance. We're going to talk about that. In 2003, he brought the bronze casting foundry he once mentored at to the Alchemist Sculpture Foundry. Along with his work, the Alchemist made a name for itself, creating large-scale work of national importance. And I can attest to that because one of my husband's aunts actually used his foundry. Before I even knew anything about Kalamazoo, I saw a sculpture that he was responsible for casting. So that's kind of 6 degrees of separation. I'm supposed to be here. Richard made sure I was here. I already knew Brent somehow, come on. Currently, he is the head of sculpture department here at the Kalamazoo Institute of Arts and the Kirk Newman Art School. He's teaching and developing new programming. He also enjoys working in the public schools as a teaching artist with the Education for the Arts. And he's also been curating here. I know for a fact he did a show at the Nature Center recently. And last but not least, our esteemed moderator, and you're in for a real treat with these three, is Michael Stone Richards, who is a scholar of critical theory, biopolitics, comparative literary and visual studies, social practice, and history and theory of modern and contemporary art practice. So he does everything. He is currently professor in critical practice and visual studies at the College for Creative Studies in Detroit. He has published widely in French and English on the avant-garde in poetry, critical theory, and art. Since his arrival in Detroit, he has become deeply involved in various parts of its arts and performance community. He has many engagements in the city and organizes the open format Conversation in the Park as part of the Detroit Seminar and Critical Practice series that he co-curates with artist Addie Langford, as well as collaborations with artists and writers with whom he shares a practice of the banquet of friends, which is convivial strategies, and with his students, the friendship of collaborative work, thought, and celebration. So please join me in welcoming Michael Stone Richards, Richard Alexander Liu, and Brent Harris. Thank you.
I'm Michael Stone Richards, and I would like to let you know how very, very happy I am to be back here. I feel today was actually the first time that I got on the Detroit-Chicago train, and a little bit slow by European standards, but I thought it was a really lovely journey. And I thought it is so much easier than I thought it would be. And I hope that since I met Rahima, I will now have many more reasons to come out. And each time I've been here, I feel that the place is larger than I remember it. And what a wonderful place. So I'm really, really happy to be here, and happy to be here with colleagues Richard and Brent. Masculinity. I'm going to moderate the conversation between Richard and Brent. We agreed that we would that they would make a very, very brief statement about their views and then pick up the conversation from there and eventually open it up to questions from the audience. One thing that I was sharing with Brent and Richard after we walked through this really, really very impressive exhibition, Rahima gave us a tour, and I swear that we could have talked at least 2 hours in front of everything. And one thing I suggested to Brent and Richard is that if we're talking about unmasking masculinity, it's first because our culture, and by our culture, I'm going to say Western culture, is going through a crisis of gender, right? There is a larger crisis in what we understand by gender, and one of the most obvious examples of that, of course, is the difficulty that many people have in recognizing different gender formations like trans identity. And then within that, another symptom, as it were, of a crisis in gender is the crisis in what we understand by masculinity. I grew up in college making a distinction between biology and culture, that as it were, masculinity is to do with culture. It's the ways in which culture shapes our perceptions of how we can behave. And whenever people ask me, given my work in gender and critical theory, why is it that for such a long time that we've got on perfectly well with just male and female? And the answer is actually very, very simple. And the answer is that because we've now started to withdraw power from the way in which gender works, right? There are a lot of things that we no longer punish, a lot of things. And the moment you begin to withdraw power, so you're not threatening people, you're not killing people, you're not hanging people. If we go to Saudi Arabia, then they're going to cut off your head, they're going to hang you or whatever for being a pervert. But the moment you withdraw power, suddenly it becomes clear that there are many more expressions of gender, right? And I would say that's the simple answer. It's simple, it can be profound depending on how you take it, but the gender becomes more complex the moment we decide that we're not going to punish certain actions of certain people. And then within that context, we can have a show like this called Unmasking Masculinity that explores then the extraordinary diversity of what it is that we mean by masculinity the moment, I would say, that we begin to withdraw certain acts of power from how gender works. So that would be my initial suggestions to what I see going on in a show like this. And I'm going to ask Richard and Brent to make some brief comments, and then I will moderate the conversation between them.
Okay, Marty, and thank you, KIA, and specifically Rahima, for inviting me. This is my first time in Kalamazoo. It's a beautiful town, and looking forward to seeing some more of it. The piece that I have in the exhibition is called The Border Door. And so a little bit of background, as Rahima pointed out, I'm half Chinese and half Mexican. And I grew up on both sides of the border. My first 8 or 9 years, we lived in Tijuana. And my father was a butcher at a local grocery store in San Diego. And so when school started, he would drive us to school and drop us off, and we would cross the border every day for about 3 or 4 years. And so that became very formative for me, because every day, Monday through Friday, my identity was questioned by the Border Patrol and the immigration officers. And so questioning, what is your business in the United States? Who are you? Let me see your documents, etc. Every day from the age 6 to the age 9. And as I said, that became a sort of a lens to see myself in relationship to the United States. And also, as Rahima pointed out, growing up in my household, where my father, was from China, and actually it was what's considered a paper son. So they used someone else's documents to bring my father to the United States, and so he was a very, very much anti-colonialist and would talk about that openly, as we were growing up. So that was also another lens to see the world. And as Rahima pointed out, my mother insisted that we would be proud of being Mexican. So in crossing the border, every day, and not feeling, fully integrated in one place or another, as I mentioned before, really framed who I was. And so this piece, The Border Door, comes from that space, but also comes from that space of, crossing the border and living as a border denizen, that the border created an opportunity to create a new space, a third space, which is a border space, a border culture. And so we were able to create this other space where we could identify with. And it became a space where there were creative opportunities, other ways to kind of think about the world. And that became very exciting to me. And especially when I started to understand my Chicano identity, becoming involved with this particular organization called the Centro Cultural de la Raza in San Diego, where meeting colleagues of mine, they helped me understand and be able to label the sort of obstacles that I had. So this particular piece is really an homage to my grandmother, who I would witness the Border Patrol, my grandmother and my grandfather, who I witnessed the Border Patrol and the immigration officers be incredibly disrespectful to. And my wife then at that time, or she wasn't my wife yet, but she was deported for helping support her family. And so this particular piece was an homage to them, and also my father, who came from China, and how he identified, how he would tell us stories about Gamsam, which is Gold Mountain in Chinese. So that's why the border door is painted gold. And also this kind of methodology that I have in regards to understanding that not only is this an artistic gesture or a cultural gesture, but it's a citizen, it's an act of citizenship, this particular piece. And a lot of the work that I do, I feel are acts of citizenship. And also I'm interested in decentering these larger narratives, especially when they become sort of site-specific, not become sort of, but when they are site-specific. I'm keenly interested in decentering the larger narratives about my home. So that's the border door sort of in a nutshell, and try and keep it as brief as possible. So, Brent.
Thank you.
and now keep mine even briefer. I really appreciate the show on masculinity. It's a powerful show, Rahima. You've done a really wonderful job with it. And masculinity has been a factor in my work from the beginning. I grew up rural. We were the first Black people to settle in our area, basically. And so I was raised in a rural community, east side of the state, and had a very strong grandfather, a very archetypical masculine, square-jawed, World War II hero, but also very distant. You know, he was a community leader and powerful man. But more than that, I was raised by my mother, single mother, and my grandmother. So I feel I found my security and my safety rooted in the earth, exploring, gardening with my grandmother, and being by my mother's side, and sort of caught between two worlds. My biological father was an alcoholic and also distant. So I feel like my sense of masculinity was sort of created ad hoc throughout my life without having a strong masculine figure to guide me, and made it up as I went along. And I've noticed retrospectively through my art that exploration has been very, very obvious. And probably, in the last few years, when we really started to dissect a little bit about what masculinity has done in our culture, I started to realize that my work has always been about the figure. It's always been about gender, masculinity, femininity. But more than that now, it's about power dynamics and what we could do to sort of change the lens of power and who holds it. So that's been my work lately. 15 years ago, I had 15 years of working in foundry, creating work, bronze sculptures. And a lot of that work ends up being monuments. And obviously we've had a lot of conversations about monuments lately. And coming out of that work, even I created quite a few. I created E.K. Warren of Warren Dunes, won the entire lakeshore of Lake Michigan. And I realized how much of my work has been concretizing power. And now that kind of coming out of that, now I'm decentering that work and kind of realizing what we can do to change that. So I do appreciate this conversation about masculinity, conversation about the land, because I think the land is about power and is about masculine ideas of power and property. And I'm looking forward to engaging in this conversation.
Brent, thank you so much. When Rahima invited me back in the summer to come join this conversation on masculinity, my first instinct was, oh, so then one more attention, is that it? But why are we talking about unmasking masculinity? And I don't want this to be just respond to me, it can be through the conversation. Why are we talking about unmasking masculinity? What else might we do about masculinity? What is it about masculinity that it needs to be unmasked?
I think masculinity is performance for sure. I mean, we all perform masculinity, and I think right now when we're seeing sort of a breakdown of gender roles, we see a lot of trans folks, a lot of people in sort of in drag, basically kind of performing masculinity, and we look at you, you're performing masculinity, performing femininity, and then without reflecting on how we perform masculinity ourselves and how that's drawn on us, from our dress, the way we walk into a room, certain expectations of power and access. So realizing that we're in the middle of performance is really important. So part of their performance is wearing a mask. So I appreciate the idea of the unmasking.
Yes, but what are we unmasking? So when you say it's a performance, who is not in a performance? Who at any time is not in a performance?
Well, I think the performer is always aware of the audience, and there's a power dynamic between the audience and the performer. Mm-hmm. I think the performer always builds up a certain power, a certain expectation, and then offers a release to the audience, and the audience has that. They come in with an expectation of that. They expect the performer to do a certain role, do a certain job. You know, we all walk into stories with certain expectation. And so when you take a mask off, then it disrupts the conversation, it disrupts the whole show.
Mhm.
And once that show gets disrupted, what is left? I think that's worth it. I think that's worth exploring.
Richard?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I go and hopefully I'll answer it in the best way I can. But then also I think about sharing space and understanding my own privilege as a man, and my interest in working collaboratively with not only with other artists, but with the public at large, and trying to open up the space in regards to the history of sites, and to open up those histories and open up for other people to participate in the art pieces in regards to where we can co-define and redefine that space, and hopefully co-define and redefine the history of the space. And so I think of it more as what are the sort of strategies I could employ or co-deploy with others when we share resources, we share power and control in regards to the kinds of work that we're interested in.
But could you just speak a little bit, sorry, my apologies, could you speak a little bit more directly to what the significance of masculinity is in the strategies of collaboration, co-creation that you're talking about? Because a title, I'm going to refer often to the title of the show, Unmasking Masculinity. There is something that needs to be revealed. And the revealing of whatever that something is will make us think in a different way, feel in a different way, behave in a different way.
That's the hope, right? In regards to my own past and current practices, helping amplify other people's voices through this metaphorical microphone that I hold, and is sort of the democratic ideal that I'm in pursuit of and others are in pursuit of, where I know there is a sort of, in my brain, there's like a utopian ideal, right? Where it unfortunately only exists in my brain, that trying to, through the transformative power of art, trying to make it happen, trying to make it manifest itself, at least in this art realm, this art piece that I've been working on, where we can model more egalitarian or more democratic processes to produce these pieces, hopefully where other people could see and use the same kind of, using that model to continue to apply to their own lives or to their own artistic practices.
Brent?
I like the phrase co-direct is what you used. And, you know, I do appreciate the idea of, I think we had talked about this earlier. Can you tell me again what the project you're working on?
The project that I'm currently working on is creating authentic stories is what we're ending up with, but we're trying to create counter narratives to harmful narratives that are currently occurring in Memphis.
Right, and that's the idea of the counter narratives, what we kind of talked about. And because when we talk about counter narratives, we are still kind of behind the eight ball of assuming that there's a predominant narrative, and we're always in relationship to that dominant narrative. So instead of maybe coming from the heart, coming from our ancestral space and stories, talking about our narratives without being countered, because there's a difficulty in always being in relationship to something that is hard to be truly honest. And so the idea about unmasking masculinity, I appreciate the vulnerability. I see a lot of the work out there.
Absolutely. One of the things I'd love to pick up, because in a way I'm seeing a very interesting difference in emphasis between your two practices, because Richard, you're talking about a border, you're talking about two countries. You also very interestingly talk about the way in which there is something other than those two countries. It's a third space, I think you call it. And I'd love to hear, Brent, you speak a little bit more, because your narrative is, each is obviously deeply felt, but you're coming from a very particular familial, intra-familial based narrative. One where there are different models of femininity, of strength, of support that you draw on. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about the importance of, women within that narrative to allow you to think differently about what masculinity might be.
Yeah, that's a good question. When it comes down to the women, I think being raised by a single mom, connecting with my grandmother, and I think there was always a very archetypal energy to the masculinity that I was presented with my grandfather, right? And it's very typical John Wayne sort of, masculine. But then there was also the grounded aspect of growing, planting, that sort of agrarian sort of understanding of the earth. And then also the understanding of like how much energy my grandfather, for example, just using as an example, was able to expend on his idea of life was granted to him by the space by his wife. She was taken from the East Coast from a very creative, artistic family, and then deposited in the Midwest, and then with really sort of the social wherewithal to really live the life that she was maybe expecting or wanted. So how much power was given to the masculine because of denial of the feminine. And so I think there was always a way that I was aware of that growing up. And so I think some of the work I do now still explores that sort of that balance between the two.
Might one say that this particular type of masculinity was the response to a kind of hurt, a hurt in prestige, a hurt in status, that didn't know how to talk about the cause of the hurt? Would that be? I feel as though what you're getting at is your mother, the female in the family are able to internalize certain things and move on with strength, but there's an alcoholic father, there's a heroic grandfather who was in the army but plays the John Wayne type.
Yeah, and I think, speaking from the personal, but I think there are stand-ins for broader social narratives. And so I think that's what I go from a personal place because that's where I come from. And I think when I teach, I try to get my students, people I'm involved with to speak from a personal place too, because they're all consistent and tied together. So I am speaking about broader aspects of maybe archetypal masculine, archetypal feminine when I'm using those.
So, Richard, you are using what you call the third space to negotiate something else where you witness disrespect towards the women in your family from people in power on this side of the border. So could you talk a little bit more then about how there is this, what you call this third space that allows you and others in between these two countries, in between these two spaces, to try and think about what you call a counter-narrative to prevailing power masculinity might be?
Yeah, I think, I'm listening to Brent and I'm thinking to myself, and this, of course, as many of us do, we have a tendency to historically look back and maybe change history a little bit. And I'm not saying in your case, Brent, I'm saying in my case. And so I have a tendency to kind of idealize the sort of relationship my parents had. They were two incredibly strong personalities that cooperated. And I think that's why I fall into the collaborative mode very easily, because I saw my parents collaborating as equals. Now, their power disparity seen as a child may have been very, very nuanced, but it appeared to me to be very, very much shared. And within my mother's family, she was clearly the head of the family on my Mexican side. So, and that was because she would hold court to, my uncles and even my grandparents, etc. She was clearly in charge of the clan. And my father, his family looked up to him, but they all worked in a very, very collective way in regards to, let's say, for example, my father, as I mentioned before, my father was a butcher, a union man, but we had an extra business selling at the swap meet in order to make ends meet. But we all, as a family, worked this business. And I saw my father not have a day off for over 20 years. Working as a butcher for 5 days a week, and then working at the swap meet, twice, Saturday and Sunday, and my mother not have a day off either. And so sacrifice and family became a very important co-measured way of existence.
Right.
And then entering into the Chicano community, which, its credo is self-sacrifice, self-determination, self-definition. It was easy for me to enter into that ideology as well. So I think that those were sort of very clear to me, determining factors for me to enter into the sort of more searching for other artists that are interested in working in a democratic way.
Yes.
And artists that are interested in suppressing their ego in order for the larger message to be heard more clearly, and without having to look at the artwork as a career move, but more as what can we do to facilitate the voice of the community and amplify the voice of the community. So I think a natural segue of how I was raised, observing my parents, observing my grandparents, my uncles and aunts, and then into a collaborative, democratic way of thinking about art making was an easy path.
I'm really fascinated that both of you are concerned with the land. And it's something that's very, very strong within a certain tradition, a certain aspect of contemporary art, but it's overlooked that Black artists are have preoccupations with land, that Chicano artists. I mean, politically, you can't imagine it otherwise, but it's something that is often not seen within the contemporary art sphere. And I wonder if you could both talk a little bit about, and maybe with each other, about the importance of land. There is a project I encountered, now it's about 8 years ago, 10 years ago, called the Black Land Project, which it was a fascinating project, and it is all about the way in which the importance to land in Black American culture has been neglected, and that needs to come to a certain visibility. So I wonder if you, since both of you are concerned with questions of land, if you could talk about that a little bit.
Well, I'll talk about it in two different ways.
Okay.
One, growing up, hearing my mother, she immigrated from a small mining town in the mountains of Sinaloa, Panuco. And at the age of 14, 15 to Tijuana to escape poverty. And she always talked about mis tierras, which means my land. But she didn't talk about my land as in a way where, this is the way I understood it. She always talked about returning to her lands, but she didn't talk about land as in a way that we think like a deed,
Right.
and ownership,
Mm.
but a land with her history.
Yes.
Yes.
A place of significance, a place of familial significance. That's what she talked about all the time. And feeling isolated living in the United States, and always having this yearning to go back to mis tierras, my land. And then the other aspect, and this is more from a Chicano ideological point of view, is thinking about the history of the land grab between the United States and Mexico in 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe, that was incredibly violated, right? Where Mexico lost half of its land to the United States, and the United States gained a third of its land. And there, the border tour becomes a counterpoint to that, right? Where it tries to amplify that long forgotten historical point. And so I'm looking at, in regards to the border door and those, more than one way, but very much the way that my mom addressed it, and also the way that history needed to be addressed.
I mean, I remember the first time as a student in school when I learned that Texas went all the way up to Nebraska. I couldn't comprehend that. Yes.
Yeah, and I think my work, you might have seen some pieces in the background here. There's two pieces in particular I think I could speak to. One would be the birth of the pyrophytic masculine, which is you see a green figure with some seeds sort of pouring out of the chest, for example. That one is the idea of like a land-based sort of like character, and then headless, egoless form of masculine. So pyrophytic meaning a plant that goes to seed under environmental stress, like a forest fire, for example. And I think the masculine being under social stress, and instead of responding with the ego, responding in a way that says, I will perform this sort of masculinity or be in this sort of way, instead of just sort of surrendering to the natural order of things, the natural way things can express themselves. There's a letting go, which is a very difficult thing to do when you're a man. And there's a vulnerability in that. So that piece is about the birth of a new type of masculinity, maybe one that hasn't existed before, and that we can step into. Another piece is persistence of vision, and that's a piece where you see there's a bust with a house frame. Mm-hmm. That, again, we talk about borders. I think there's also sort of under white supremacy, there's there are obviously very bordered property lines. My family history of migration is a deep part of my understanding, but it's also the moving borders when it comes down to kind of white men and the borderline between their space and your space. And that moves, the ball is always being moved. The goal line is always being moved. And so, so this piece was really about when we crossed into that space. I think growing up in Black in a rural space, being on the Black face there's a lot of fear engaging in this natural world that I grew up in, that I rooted in. But when I'm out there on my own, there's always that possibility of violence.
Right. There's also a thing in your work. I don't know if we could see the rabbit iconography, which is hermaphroditic. And it's as though there is a kind of bisexuality of the land that comes into the animal form.
Yeah, absolutely. The rabbit, being the feminine, the hare being the masculine. There's, every culture has a story about the rabbit. They're diurnal. There's a way that they also explore. Death psychology is something I explore in my work. There's something about the rabbit, how they go down deep into the burrow. So they go underground, they explore the unconscious. Then they come up, and they are messengers in that regard. So there's things that they can explore and bring up to our conscious selves.
Absolutely. Anything in the exhibition that particularly, it is a superb exhibition, but any work in the exhibition that you find really striking that you might want to talk about? We have a long conversation, series of conversations this afternoon. Of course, more than we would like, we have time to. Anything about the show that you'd like to bring up? And I'm going to open this up to the audience in a moment.
The James Luna piece, I found striking, and the the harkening back to him impersonating these different personalities, different historical personalities, contemporizing them, ensuring that that we understand that struggle continues, that past is not a static past, or that culture is not a static culture. That resonated with me, and then of course he was a dear friend of mine, so it was shocking to see the work.
Yes.
So at a personal level, and so it when I rounded the corner, I mean, when I saw the show, and hats off to the two curators, Rahima and I mean, I wish the show was in Memphis, but I felt that very much at home with all the work, because of all the interrogation that's occurring in a multivalent way. But the James Luna piece, because of my personal connection, really hit home.
It's really wonderful.
Cool. Really wonderful. Brent,
Probably easy one to say, but the Nick Cave piece.
the Nick Cave
Nick
sounds.
Cave, it's just his work, and that piece just blew me away. Absolutely.
I mean, we almost had to be dragged away from that.
I know.
Yeah. Can I ask if anyone from the audience would like to pose a question?
I was just interested in, I've forgotten your name, but.
Richard, Brent, Richard.
You said your father is, Oriental,
Chinese, yeah.
Chinese.
Was.
Was he born here or was he?
No, he
So the question is, was Richard's Chinese heritage father born here?
No, he was not. He was not born here. He was not born in the United States. And this was during the Chinese Exclusion Act law that wasn't rescinded until, I think, 1946 or something. And so Chinese immigration stopped 1882. And so we understand that there were a lot of Chinese that immigrated to Mississippi because the most recently emancipated Black people that were there, the former slave owners wanted to pit one labor group against another. And so they started to bring a lot of the labor brokers started to bring Chinese to the South. And so my family comes from that. And so our grandfather, who's not really our grandfather, adopted my father from China and brought him over using his son's birth certificate that died while he was in China. And so that's how my father came to the United States. And interestingly enough, my father also served in World War II in the Marine Corps. And so, and still, even during his service was the Chinese Exclusion Act was still in force. And so, and here's the interesting thing about colonial power is that they're really great at archiving their misdeeds. And so I have a lot of information about my father's travels back and forth because it was incredibly well documented.
Absolutely.
Any other questions from the audience, please? Rahima, curator, chief curator.
I do have a question. So, we've been talking about the border door, Richard, but you actually have a history of doing like interventions in public space.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm really curious about how because this isn't the border door isn't your first intervention in public space. And can you talk a bit more about how I feel like your process is really about like taking down and dismantling barriers that might be put up in public space. Whereas I also feel like Brent's work is about looking at ways that we need to be looking at nature and nurturing, like building up. So there's a push and pull between the two of you there. Could you talk?
So Rahima's question is, the border door is your first intervention in public space. Your work is about dismantling certain things in that space, whereas Brent's work is about nurturing, building up. Could you address more of that?
Sure. Gloria Anzaldúa has this wonderful phrase where she says that we take our borders with us, or wherever we are, that's where the border is. And so that particular frame or lens obviously travels with me. So when I was hired when I was hired at the University of Memphis to lead the department, one of the faculty members said, "Hey, do you know about the Confederate parks here?" And so she took me over to what used to be called the Nathan Bedford Forrest Park. And Nathan Bedford Forrest was a Confederate general and responsible for the Fort Pillow massacre and other atrocities, and revered by the neo-Confederates. And so we went together there, and I'm like, wow. And so I created this performance, and actually Rahima was kind enough to host a really interesting and wonderful panel discussion during a tornado warning, where 70 people showed up, even during a tornado warning.
That's
impressive. And but anyways, where I created this performance where we built these boxes, and when we stacked the boxes in front of the equestrian statue, and if you were sitting in front of it, it would disappear and another image would be presented. And then I invited 6 residents of Memphis to come and tell their stories. And so during the process, you would hear singing as spirituals, and then people building these boxes in a pyramidal shape. And then someone would come out, the singing would cease, and then someone would tell their story, and then they would dismantle the boxes in silence, and then they would reassemble the boxes, more singing as spirituals, and then someone else would come and tell the story over and over again 6 times. And then the last one was this indigenous dancer, this Aztec dancer, told his story, and then danced all around the equestrian statue of Forrest. And so I think that my desire to use the site that's already loaded with history as a way of interrogating that history, interrogating that site, and for, in a very, very modest way, complicate the site for an hour, versus it was erected in 1904. And so I complicated the space for an hour out of all those almost 1 million hours that has transpired. So I'm very interested in that sort of thing. Did another performance as well, but I'd like to hand the mic over to Brent.
So Brent, your work is more nurturing, is that Rahima?
Nurturing, generative.
Generative?
Yeah, I appreciate people. I appreciate their stories. I think we all have stories that are more universal than we like to admit to. And so I appreciate your storytelling as well. I think we all have story to tell. So I think there's a certain point where you can sort of bring a story from our history, and then find out there's access points and we can sort of step into those stories and tell, add into that narrative. And so often society has ways to tell our story for us, by through our parents, through our friends, through culture, broader culture in general. And I think art is just a really good way to sort of like bypass some of that a little bit, do a little personal interrogation, and really sort of do a little critique, a little self-critique, and through that self-critique, explore some different ideas of the self.
Could I, Shannon, if we could move on to one of the rallied images, Brent, one more, I think there's maybe, yeah, that's great. You, from your language earlier, it sounds to do with death psychology or interested in Jung, but you know, one of the fundamental theses in psychoanalysis, which Jung broke with, but I think that he agreed with, is what's called the bisexuality of the inner life. That at some level in our inner lives, we are bisexual within the inner lives before all of these things become settled socially, right? So social conditioning will train us in this way. And one of the things that art does is to enable the artist and the viewer through the art to participate in a kind of bisexuality. Is that what we're looking at here?
Yeah, 100%. With Jung, I think individuation is when we finally sort of resolve the conscious with the collective unconscious, resolve our shadow self with our conscious self, and also the anima and the animus, the masculine and the feminine energies. So that is absolutely we all the masculine has the anima that they have to spend their entire life resolving, and the women have the feminine has the animus, the masculine side that they have to resolve eventually. But eventually it does come to the bisexuality. I think the rabbits do represent that absolutely. She does have aspects of masculine with a bigger chest, but then also I'm sort of playing with a little bit with the idea of the gaze, the viewer's gaze. You know, that's sort of like she defending her femininity by confronting the viewer directly.
And I'm pushing the question in a slightly other way to say, is this something? I mean, so because I didn't want it to sound theoretical, that we as viewers are drawing on, and you as an artist, that you are drawing on this inner bisexuality, that is where we experience this bisexuality, not just, I mean it not just as the theory that is finding, an illustration, but that there are certain moments when we look at art, we can feel something other than what we normally think of ourselves as.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a way that there's the sexual and the gendered aspect. But I also would like to sort of disengage a little bit of sexuality from it and really explore a little bit deeper the ideas of masculine and feminine that are cross-cultural, that are always, it's something that's always been in contrast to each other. So there's ways we always have to resolve both. But, we do have this tendency to sort of sexualize the ideas, which are important. Sexuality is broadly important, but it also is a way to sort of diminish sort of the, because there is such a power balance right now, a big power struggle between the masculine and the feminine, like very masculinized American culture that's losing its power. So, I think there's, I'm sort of
Is that then
losing what you're asking, I guess.
Yes, but is that is that why we're in crisis? Because, as it were, a certain image of masculinity is simply losing its power. Is that what you're saying? Is that right with your work?
Not in the South.
Not in the South. No. Right.
No, yeah, in the South it's been codified. So males rule.
Okay. But do they really? Because I think women are very powerful, and women are much better storytellers.
Absolutely. But
In the South.
according to the legislature, that it has been codified in regards to creating a second-class citizenry,
Right.
and how in the educational system that opposing forces will be silenced in regards to talking about these sorts of issues right now. And so, and it's something that we're struggling with as academics and as citizens,
Mm-hmm.
but it's a real thing. So maybe in Michigan you can say, but the struggle continues. But and I'm not saying that it's a settled account,
Right.
but right now, legislatively,
Yes.
we have an uphill battle.
It must be.
Please, person from the audience.
There are parts of what each of you has talked about the entire time that have alluded to this, but I'm wondering if you would describe, if we could imagine the masks coming down, like the curtain opening to announce the real actors at the end of the play, how would our world look different if we pulled the mask off?
Great question. If we could imagine the mask coming down like actors at the end of a play, how would the real world look? Brent, Richard, that's an easy one.
Definitely world without borders, for sure. You know, I think borders are, they're protective, you know, they're obviously there to keep a power structure alive. And the same with gender, you know, it keeps a power structure alive. And so I think it really does start with X. That's what we're born with, and that's what we're always in. It's the easiest thing to control.
Is your question aspirational or an assessment of what I see right now?
Aspirational. In your imagining, what would that be?
Supporting a radical feminist agenda.
We should join, I mean, Andre Breton on the great surrealist thinker said something similar. You know, I come from the country where a great playwright said all the world's a stage, Shakespeare. He also said in another one of his great plays, Coriolanus, there's a line from Coriolanus that Karl Marx liked to quote, "There is a world elsewhere." So the person who said all the world is a stage also said, and we can find another world in which we can live. So that would be my response to that. So the unmasking asks us to assume different kinds of powers, different kinds of capacities. Because fundamentally what are we addressing is, because ideally we would like to think that we can live without power, and I'm not sure that is possible. So what the real issue is domination, right? We want to escape domination, and that means imagining different use of human capacities. And that's how I understand Shakespeare's line, "There is a world elsewhere." We can do better than this, right?
And I think that through that is just a deep love and understanding. I think there's a deep listening that will be involved with that sort of change. I think there'd be less of a need for dominance, less of a need to control.
Mm-hmm.
You know, a lot more cooperation, a lot more conversation, and a lot less fear or, you know, aggression, fear masquerading as aggression,
Mm-hmm.
and repression, and shutting down conversations, and actually opening up those conversations.
Richard?
Yeah, I was just going to say that in Bell Hook's wonderful book, From Margin to Center, she talks about not replacing the same power system with others, but dismantling the systems of dominance. And what does that look like? That's something that we all have to participate in. And also, I in a conversation, an interview that was published, not plugging anything, but with Dr. Gisela La Torre, she said something really powerful to me. And she said that the utopian ideals exist within these radical social movements that are occurring right now, that they're searching for it, like in the Black Lives Matter, or the No Mas. The No Mas is the social movements that are against violence against women in Chile. And so she talked about different social movements. And she says you can find the utopian ideals there, where they're interrogating power, dismantling, and offering another vision.
And those visions have existed, those worlds have existed. I mean, we are living in such a repressed, complicated, constructed world that we kind of forget that our present is not where we've always been. You know, we've been there before, we can get there again.
I'm getting a little red paper sign saying it's time to
I need to
give in. Okay, so thank you very, very, I'd like to thank our speakers, Richard and Brent. Rahima, thank you again for a fabulous show, and thank you very much for joining us this evening.